Welcome to Wellspring on the Air. I'm Lindsay Steffen, a licensed mental health counselor at Wellspring, and I'm here today with Tova, our founder and president. Thank you for being here, Tova.
Thank you for doing this with me. I think we have an important topic today.
Yes, today we're going to be talking about suicide. We have suicide awareness and prevention coming up, but we want to specifically talk about this during the pandemic right now. We're in the coronavirus pandemic. There are just mental health issues skyrocketing right now.
Yes.
And we definitely want to address the severe depression that leads to suicide, suicidal thoughts, and hopefully educate our audience members who might be struggling themselves or have family or friends, co-workers who are struggling with some of these dark thoughts. So,
right. We're not trying to, it is a sad topic and a hard topic, but it's important that we tune into it so we're able to take actions and for people we love and people around us, or for ourselves if we find ourselves there.
Absolutely. And the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, they released some pretty alarming stats that just in the last, let's say it was June of 2020, in 1 week, 11% of people who responded had seriously considered suicide as an option in the last 30 days. So out of 5,400 US adults 18 and older, they were polled, and more than 40% reported that they were having at least one adverse mental health or behavioral health condition. So and you might want to talk a little, Tova, about the specific populations.
Yeah, this was such an alarming statistic. It came out, published from CDC on August 14th, and I was just stunned. I teach on suicide on somewhat of a regular basis, and it's always a prevalent thing. There's always a million people who die each year from suicide, according to the World Health Organization. It's the 10th leading cause of death in America. Every 12 minutes, somebody in America dies normally by suicide, but these statistics blew my socks off. We are in a mental health pandemic. 40% saying they have some mental health issues going on as a result of this that's happening, our pandemic. But 1 in 10, 11% in the last 30 days seriously thought about suicide. But let's talk about the other statistics within that, because I was just, of the 18 to 24-year-olds, 25% seriously considered the suicide in the last month. That's astounding.
That's 1 in 4. Yeah.
Right. Are thinking about suicide. It's terrifying. You know, it is higher for those who are Hispanics were at 18%, blacks were at 15%, and here are a couple other ones. Essential workers were at 21%. They're having a rough time. And unpaid caregivers of adults, so those taking care of the elderly or something, and they're not paid. It's not their job. They're trapped at home taking care of somebody. 30% had considered suicide in the last 3 days. So, yeah, we have to address this. Now, I know I'm being an alarmist, but the CDC alarmed us all first, and so those of us who are in this field, we have to dive in. You asked about a couple other stats just so we know them. Men are more likely to die by suicide than women. Women have proportionately more attempts relative to their deaths, but men by far succeed more. We don't really know all the reasons for that, but we can get to some of that later. I do think it's important to note that American Indian men are even higher than white men, but it's those white men and those American Indian men who are struggling the most for a variety of reasons. You know, it doesn't discriminate by age. We actually don't call it suicide if it's under 5 years old, which is terrifying that a little tiny child could do this. But there are even statistics for 5 to 14-year-olds all the way up to 85 and plus. And so every age has people who do die by suicide.
Wow. So I think we talk about suicide, we hear about suicidal ideation, these different terms, but I think it'd be helpful for our audience to know, how do you actually define some of these things? So let's just start with the definition of suicide. What is that, Tova?
Yeah, so the official one is when people direct violence against themselves with the intent to end their lives, and they die because of their actions. So that one's kind of self-evident. But I do think it's important that we think about the words we use, because like people say, oh, he committed suicide. That's actually no longer a very PC term, you know,
Mhm.
or even the term successful suicide. You know, we just, those have negative connotations, but committing suicide makes it a crime. And so you commit a crime, and it is violence against yourself, and somebody did die, but people who are doing this are not trying to commit a crime. They're not killers. They are
Right.
desperately attempting to escape something that for them is insufferable. And so we just want to take away those negative connotations when we talk about suicide. And so no longer we say death by suicide, not committed suicide. It would be how
Yeah.
we would talk about it together.
Yeah, and I
Um,
can vouch for that even clinically with clients. Those who have had those suicidal thoughts or ideation, they don't see any other option. So, of course, there's some cloudy thinking, mental health stuff going on, but it feels like the only way to find relief or to not feel these negative emotions is through death. And so, think how severe you must, like, how horrible you're feeling if that feels like the only option for you. So, really, it should spark a lot of compassion in us, I believe.
Yeah, people who are left behind often feel like you did this to me, you abandoned me, and those are not really the thoughts of I'm going to abandon my family or get revenge on my family. It's really they become so self-loathing and depression that they may assume people are better off without them, falsely assume,
Yeah,
but they're not, again, trying to create harm to their family because they don't care about
right.
people or any of those things.
Yeah.
Um,
Most
yeah.
suicidal people we find are deeply conflicted about ending their own lives. It's not something they want to do. It feels almost like a forced decision, are the kind of words I've heard. They just don't see an alternative.
And that is so important to remember, because they're conflicted, like that's how why we can intervene. That's why we can make a difference. If we can help them
Yeah.
know there's a reason to stay alive, or there's hope for change, then we can enter in at that conflicted moment versus just assuming, well, they're suicidal, and that's kind of a myth. They're suicidal, so they'll find a way because they're determined. They're not determined. They just can't see a reason to get out of the situation they're in. So it's important.
Right. What about suicide attempt? How would you define that?
Okay, this is a good one because it's a potentially self-injurious behavior with a non-fatal outcome for which there's evidence of some intent to die. So um, we can have a suicide attempt that has no injuries. And
Hmm.
so it's important to know that. So I had a client once who drove her car through a guardrail on a parking lot on like the fourth floor.
Wow.
And it hit a second guardrail and didn't go over. So she had no injury. Her car had a little injury, but she had no injury.
Yeah.
But that was definitely a suicide attempt. You know, there's evidence that she had an intent to die. So that's a
Okay.
suicide attempt.
Okay. And what about ideation? We hear the term suicidal ideation.
Yeah, it's kind of like the step before. It's like I'm thinking about it. And this is where we as therapists really take note, take action, know that this is a very, very big deal if someone's thinking about it. They may never make an attempt, but this is where we know we need to be worried and why we're doing this show. So it's the thoughts of engaging in suicidal behavior with or without the specific plan. It's I wish I were dead. I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about death or dying or leaving or if I weren't here. And there's this recurring theme of a thought life about not being here anymore by dying by suicide.
Sure. And I think even there, it can be more passive or active. I see
Mm-hmm.
clients who have I just wish I wasn't alive, but they don't have a plan or an idea what to do. But it's just, if I died today, that would be fine. I'm so
Mm-hmm.
miserable. It's kind of that passive ideation we have to look for as well.
It is. And then all the way up to I have an active plan with, a gun in my room and it's loaded and I'm ready. And
Right.
so that we have degrees of ideation for sure.
Yeah. What about a
One,
gesture? Oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was going to say a gesture, suicidal gesture. I know that's one we don't hear as commonly, perhaps.
Well, and we want to get rid of that phrase
Okay.
because it really is a negative label. It's kind of
Mm.
dismissive. You didn't really mean it. It was just a gesture like a cry for help or
Okay.
wanting attention. And we basically say, and I know you agree with this, if there's a quote gesture, if there is any of this ideation or attempt, it is real. Because
Right.
if you need attention for that, there is a major issue happening.
Mm,
And even if it's quote manipulative, there's still a major issue, because people who are in a
right.
good state don't do that. And so regardless, is worth taking very seriously, and not dismissing. It's a dismissive idea. Oh, it was just a gesture. They didn't mean it. It's severe, and we need to treat it as such.
Yeah, it's still a cry for help, no matter if, whether it was a serious idea to do it or not, they're still asking for some intervention. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Okay. What about non-suicidal self-injury?
Well, I think it's important to know that you can do self-injury for reasons other than suicidal, as the goal. So,
Mm,
for cutting is the most common, where I I cut myself. It's not really with an intent to die. It's an intent to release or express pain that I can't express in another way. Or it's an
right.
attempt to feel pain because I'm so numb because of things that have happened. So that's a little different. It's just as dangerous, just as important to be responding to people who are
Yeah.
self-injurious. They're doing dangerous behavior on a regular basis, whether it's their drug use or driving reckless, all sorts of things, but it may not. Oh, the point is, you could have injury that you really wasn't about dying. It was about another goal,
Right.
but still a goal.
Yeah, and I always watch those as a clinician because those
Yeah.
can be, stepping stones or steps towards then more severe ideation. But yeah, some people who cut or have self-injury, they're not thinking of dying. It's just that emotional release of pain, like you're saying. So, okay. Well, why should we be concerned about suicide attempts? That's kind of that's
Well,
a leading question.
it is a leading question, but it increases the risk factors. So, um, adolescents make many, many more attempts than adults. So 8 per
Mm,
100 adolescents will make a suicide attempt versus 10 per 100,000 for adults. So there are a lot of reasons young people that they don't know that um, life could get better. So they often feel like it's worse than it is. They don't realize, they don't have enough life experience to know that it could go on, or they could get past this, they could love again, they could have
right.
a better year next year without bullies. They lack a prefrontal cortex, which is the development of our brain that says I plan for the future. So there are a lot of reasons that is true, but suicide attempts are what you have to do to actually commit to die by suicide. See, I caught myself, to die by suicide. And so it is a predictor of a future event where they are successful. Again, I don't want to use successful, where they die by suicide. So
Yeah, it's hard because we've heard these words for years in
I know.
TV shows, culturally, and I know even as a practitioner, I have to rework my verbiage. Absolutely.
I'm working at it. I teach this stuff, but
Yeah.
but in any case, it makes a risk factor. People who have made an attempt are much more likely to make another attempt. It's just a correlated statistic, so we need to pay attention. So
Yep. Okay. Well, this is a great stopping point. We're going to take a short break, but please tune in for the second part of our show. We're going to talk a little bit more about self-care, strategies, how to actually practically deal with these feelings of distress that lead to suicidal thoughts or attempts. So I'm Lindsay Steffen with Wellspring on the Air, and we will be right back. Welcome back. I'm Lindsay Steffen with Wellspring on the Air, and I'm here with Tova Krebs, our president and co-founder. We've been talking today about suicide. During this global pandemic with the coronavirus, mental health statistics are on the rise. We have a lot more depression, anxiety, and definitely more thoughts of suicide. As we reviewed in our previous segment of the show, just the CDC released some very alarming statistics. So we want to take time to address this together. So let's just dive right in. Tova, what are some of the risk factors for suicide? How do we know we should be concerned?
yeah, and so it's interesting because risk factors are different than warning signs. So very quickly on risk factors, these are things that statistics say have a higher correlation with people who die by suicide. So very quickly, having had a prior suicide attempt, depression or a mental health disorder, actual mental illness, substance abuse. And you can see why that's a risk factor, because you're not making good judgments when you're under the influence, right?
Right.
A family history of mental health or substance abuse disorder. Um, so that's not that it's a genetic trait. It's important to know that. But having a mental illness might be like bipolar disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder.
Right.
Um, but then the secondly similar is the fifth one was a family history of suicide, and
Mm,
that has more to do with sometimes a belief system. Well, my mother did it, maybe it does run in the family. You know, it's almost a self-predictive thing. This is something that happens in my family, and so it can be normalized in some sort of not good way.
yeah.
Um, the sixth one is having a history of trauma, violence, or abuse. Those traumatic events can distort our thinking. They can make us feel more helpless. Maybe PTSD symptoms may be too hard to live with because of those traumatic events. I know you do a lot of work in this. Did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think for sure when we have trauma and kind of untreated trauma, we're not ourselves. And so our thinking is all governed by triggers. Everything in the world might trigger us, people, places, things, smells. And so it becomes unbearable to even exist in the world. And severe depression, anxiety, PTSD kind of drives people to feeling like the only way to escape this horror is to die. And I've heard things like that. And luckily we do our treatment, people realize, oh, there is an alternative, obviously healing, but sometimes if they haven't been exposed to counseling or mental health resources, they actually don't know that's an alternative to not
Right.
feel this way without suicide.
That's right. Well, other risk factors, and again, risk factors don't mean somebody's going to die by suicide. They just mean the statistics say there's a higher correlation. So having a gun in the house, I think that's about access to an easy way,
Yeah.
you know, to die. Being in prison or in jail, being exposed to other people's suicidal behavior, kind of like I mentioned to earlier, like a family figure or a media figure, that we know that when major media figures die by suicide, that there are bumps in it,
Right.
including even like the 13 Reasons there was a big increase in teen suicide.
Yeah.
So medical illness, having a recent loss or a stressful event, I'll talk about that in just a second, can be a risk factor, or being socially isolated and lonely. And I think we're seeing that right now in the pandemic.
I think that's a big factor. You were talking about the at-home caregivers, and think of, they
Mm-hmm.
were already pretty isolated, but now it's hard to even do any normal social things or have some connection because maybe the person they live with is vulnerable, so they have to just stay home. So I think that's huge. Isolation. A lot of my clients who live alone aren't seeing people, a lot of boredom and loneliness. I'm seeing that for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
Um, so let's talk about the warning signs, because that's a little different than risk. This is what we want to look for in our friends, our loved ones, or even in ourselves, and realize, wow, I'm not in a good place.
Mhm.
So the first one is talking about suicide. So when people say, oh, you know, even casually in family settings, you know, you'd be better off without me, or
Mhm.
I'd be better off dead. We really need to take note. That's an actual warning sign. It means they're having the ideation. Something's going through their heads that's making them think that.
Right.
um, the next one is a preoccupation with death. So people really, you might see this more in young people too. So what happens when you die? How do they die? Where do they go? What happens with the body? You know, maybe seeing our young people looking at very graphic, being fascinated by things of death, and
Yeah.
that's what they're looking at in their media, or what they're drawing in their art, and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, you see that a lot with art therapy, even kids, very dark themes or yeah. Also, I think, something I noticed that's definitely a warning sign is just no hope for the future. We talked about that a little
Mm-hmm.
bit, but feeling like there's no escape, there's no end to this pain.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I notice with a lot of clients, self-loathing or self-hatred. So if they feel like I'm a zero, no one cares about me, I don't care about myself, that's a big warning sign and kind of a risk factor there too.
Right. You know, we could also have people who say goodbye, you know, well, it's been great. No, they have these kind of concluding statements. Well, it's been great knowing you, or thank you for this. And you're like, why are you saying goodbye when we have an ongoing relationship?
Right.
Withdrawing from others on a regular basis. They no longer want to go to the family gatherings. They just no, I'll eat in my room, or I don't want to come out, or, so withdrawing. Self-destructive behavior is a warning sign. So again, those things that may not look like death by suicide, but we're drinking and driving and we know better. We're driving without seatbelts. People are increasing their drug use, with recklessly, and not that
Right.
it's ever not reckless, but anyway, um,
But
seeking
maybe it
out,
starts to
go ahead,
ramp up. We noticed that
ramp
with
up.
clients. Yeah.
Seeking out lethal means they're getting access to pills or guns or objects that they could use.
Yeah.
Similar to saying goodbye is getting your affairs in order. So giving away my stuff, hey, if I ever weren't here, I want you to have this, or I want you to have that, and suddenly the will is all written and things are done, and, getting affairs in order. And
Yep.
then that similar again, there's this last sense of calm. Sometimes we can have someone we knew was suicidal, and then suddenly they're like, no, I'm not suicidal. I'm fine. I'm good. But there's a calm that's kind of not natural. And it's
Right.
really maybe because they've made a true plan, and now they feel peaceful because they've made a plan, and they feel good that their suffering is going to end.
Right.
And so,
I'm glad you highlight that, because sometimes we're like, oh, someone was, in severe distress, and then the next day they're fine. And we should know that's a warning sign. That's not normal. You don't go from being right with like active anxiety, depression to just okay overnight. So I'm glad you
right.
educated us on that. Well, let's jump into some myths. I think there's so many myths about suicide. People are scared to do this, say this with people. So let's go ahead and debunk some of those.
Yeah.
Number
So,
one,
go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say people who talk about suicide won't really do it. That's a myth. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think most of the time, people actually do give some warning signs. And so they're not just talk, they're actually processing and putting it out there. And so, yeah, no, people talk because they're thinking about it. And so it's a myth. Oh, they're just, yeah, back to that gesture idea that we talked about earlier.
Right. So don't ignore it. It might indicate serious suicidal feelings and thoughts.
Agreed.
Okay. What
I,
about, oh, go ahead.
I
Mhm.
think another myth is that people who are suicidal or thinking about suicide are actually crazy. It's easy
Mm,
for us to say they're all mentally ill, and there is a correlation with mental illness, because if you are really depressed, you are going to get lost in depressive thoughts. If you're obsessive compulsive, you might obsess on this thought. So there
right.
can be mental illness that relates to suicide, but it doesn't mean that somebody who's thinking about it is having mental illness, because people can have um, these thoughts because they are just that lonely or that hopeless or other things or that distressed over a recent life event.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean there's something that there is mental illness. There may be, but there may not be. And so kind of
Yeah.
dismissing it like, oh, it's just those people, whoever those are, which is half of us. But
Right.
it's important when we not do that.
Yep, absolutely. A third myth I know I've heard is that, if someone's going to kill themselves, you can't stop them. Nothing's going to stop them. So what's the fact there? That's definitely a myth.
Yeah. And I think sometimes afterwards we realize we did a lot of things and we still couldn't prevent it. So I want to have mercy on the people who later like, oh, I should have done something else. It can be true that people who are determined at some point we can't stop them. But on the pre-end, it's really not true at all. It goes back to that ambivalence. People really don't want to die as much as they
Right.
want the suffering to stop, or they think it won't, or they feel trapped or hopeless. And so lots of things can stop people, because if we give them hope, if we tell them they matter, that there's an answer, or there's professional help, or things can be done that will make their life different or positive, and God's will for their lives to love them, and He has plans for us and things like that. There are many, many things that can prevent someone from taking those actions.
Yeah. Well, that leads me into our next myth, is that people who die by suicide are unwilling to seek help. But that is a myth, because we see that more than half of people who have committed suicide, or these studies of suicide victims, they actually sought medical help in the 6 months prior to their deaths. So more
Yeah.
than half that's a population that is not wanting to die necessarily, but again, don't see another way out.
Yeah, people do seek help. They may not get the right help, or they may not have been able to stick with it or afford it, or get into it, but it doesn't mean they're not trying in any way to do something different
Right.
to make their lives better.
Yep. So that leads us to our last myth. And this is one I really love to talk about. So talking about suicide might give someone the idea. That is so not true. So please tell us a little about that, Tova.
Yeah, we don't give them an idea. They already have the ideas. What it does is it takes it out of a secret into something that can be handled and talked about. If we bring it up and they're like, no, I've never really thought about it, then it's like, okay, I was worried about you, and now I know not to be. And all
Right.
they know is that you care. But this idea that you're going to plant the idea that if the ideas aren't there, they're going to be like, what are you talking about? And if the ideas
Right.
are there, they're going to feel so relieved that someone noticed and cares, and there's an opportunity to talk. The secret is very dangerous, so we need to move it out of
Yeah.
the realm of secrets into
Yeah.
the other.
A little shout out to my parents of my teen clients. I think it's a big fear to ask their teens about those thoughts. But yeah, over and over, the teen, once they're in my office, they want to talk about that. Because again, they don't want to die most of the time. So yeah. All right.
Well, Lindsay, we have way more to give. We're going to make this into 2 shows. So I think
Okay.
I want to wrap up with
Yeah.
one little piece. And then when we have the second part of the show that our listeners can tune into and hear, which is lots of practical ways to intervene. We need to spend more
Awesome.
time there. So I'm going to give an overview of it, and then we'll do a part 2. All right.
Perfect. Let's do
So
it.
the overview is this, that why do people die by suicide? And how can we help? So they come in kind of categories. One is they die by suicide. They take an action to end their lives because they have unclear thinking. That is the mental health issue. They are depressed, and so their thinking isn't solid. All they can see is the negative. They have OCD, and they are stuck on the thought, or they're bipolar and they're swinging with a manic or a depressive state, or they're using substances, and so they're not in their right mind at the time. So the answer to unclear thinking and how can we help is to help them get professional help, because
Right.
all of those need professional help. But that's not the only reason people make this choice. A second is that they have unbearable circumstances in their minds. That's how they see it. And again, it may not be mental illness at all, but they have a belief that their circumstances are unbearable. So we have this high rate of white men who die by suicide, right? Well, it's often following their exposure of a moral failure or a bankruptcy. It's their worldview of themselves. And if it falls apart for some reason, they believe my family's better off with my insurance money. My family is better. There's a belief they cannot bear the circumstances of the exposure.
Right.
It may be another unbearable circumstances might be abuse. So it might be a youth who's living with bullying, and they think that I can't bear this bullying anymore. Or abuse victims who are in their homes, whether it's an adult with a domestic violence or a youth, and it's like I can't bear it anymore.
Right.
Another unbearable circumstance that can relate to suicide is life after a trauma or a loss. It's like I cannot see my life with this change, without this person, with this event in my past, with this experience. I don't have a picture of myself. And this is just a normal stage of grief, because part of the grief process is eventually to be able to see yourself continuing after the loss. But some people don't get past that. Or a terminal illness. So all these things are unbearable circumstances. And how do we help those people? We give them love at the time, and we give them hope that life can go on.
Absolutely.
And when people are around and loving us really well, and life can go on, and they help paint that picture for us, honey, we can still love you even if you failed or went bankrupt. We can still be here for you even though this loved one's gone and others are here. And so that's what we do. And then the third broad category, besides unclear thinking, unbearable circumstances, the third one is a hopeless future. And in that one, again, the elderly, the isolated, people in chronic illnesses, we need to give them hope that their life can still have meaning while they're here, while they're suffering, to those around them. So I know
Yeah.
I went through that really fast and we're past our time, but this is why we have to do part two.
Yes, there's too much good stuff here we need to share with the audience and educate. And yeah, and I think, again, going back to that part, the hopeless future, we can hold hope for people until they have it again for themselves. So
Mm-hmm.
we'll expound more on this, though, in part two. So we'll wrap up for today. Thank you, Tova. And we will definitely, if you have any questions or concerns, reach out to Tova. She's very open to communicate with our audience. Her email is Tova, Tova, at wellspringmiami.org. Visit our website, wellspringmiami.org, and check out our other resources, podcasts. And we will just have to wrap up for today, though. We're out of time. So I'm Lindsay Steffen with Wellspring on the Air, because hearts and minds matter.